Okay, so from souls back to minds, and in particular to the other minds problem, which is the issue we'll look at for the last week. We'll look at a particular and more kind of relevant and, in a sense, poignant version of it, realistic version of it, the other kinds of minds problem, so work in animal cognition. Okay, so what's the problem here, the other minds problem? So you feel a pain, you see red, you have a belief, you experience having a desire, etc. Well, you might wonder what, if anything, it's like for someone else to have, say, a phenomenal experience, to have a qualitative experience of pain or of seeing red, etc. You might wonder, is it like anything for anybody else? When I feel that pain, is it like anybody else when they are under similar circumstances? And you might wonder then, generalizing from that, whether other people, aside from yourself, have mental states, like phenomenal experiences or beliefs at all. Or are you the only one? So that view, of course, is called solipsism, the view that you're the only mind in the universe, and everything else is just, we now have the terminology to state these sorts of things. Everybody else is, every apparent other person is really a zombie or something. So there are three problems, as you'll have seen from the study guide for this week, three problems here, which are all related and intertwined. The first is the basic epistemological problem. It's epistemological because it's about justification, and it's asking what justification could you ever have for thinking that people other than yourself have mental states? What justification is there? And so we'll think about that question. There's also the conceptual question, how it's possible to even form a concept of mental states other than your own. So the only direct access you have to mental states is through your own mental states. And so it seems like the concept we have of mental states very easily applies to other people, but the only etiology for it, for that concept, is from our own experience of, say, phenomenal states and having beliefs. So how is it that we can even form a concept of mental states that so easily applies to people other than ourselves? And then there's the psychological problem, which is related in a way to the issue we were looking at last week. How do we actually attribute mental states to other people and entities? What kind of mind do, well, not you need in doing the attributing, but what kind of mind does one need, does an entity need, in order for you to do this, to attribute mental states to others? So you don't attribute mental states to lots of things in your environment, the table, the chairs, etc., unless you're a committed panpsychist. But you do to other entities. And then, of course, there's going to be an area where it's not clear, and that's one of the areas that we'll look at when we come to looking at animal minds at the end of today. Okay, so here I'm drawing on the Stanford Encyclopedia article on other minds, which is listed in the, I think there's a link to it on Moodle, and it's listed in the study guide as well, but just a link to it here for your own reference. So the basic problem here, as I alluded to a moment ago, is a basic asymmetry. So the idea that you have self-knowledge, privileged access, and introspection, you've got some kind of special access to your own mental states that you don't have to other people's mental states. And when you're in a mental state, you know what mental state you're in immediately, whether it's a pain experience or a phenomenal experience at all, or instead a belief or some cognitive state like that. So you can introspect, just look inward as it were, and see what mental state you're in. So introspection here, just remember, is that kind of looking inward, observation of your own mental states. But the problem is that you can't look into another person's mind in this way. And so how do you know that they have one? That's the basic statement of the problem of other minds. We have this introspective access to our own mental states. It seems clear that we have them, we know what types they are, etc. But how do we know that other people have mental states at all, given that we can't have that kind of access to their minds? So here's a quote that some of you will have seen before in my introductory unit. from Descartes. He says, well, look, in this case, looking out the window, say, I do not fail to say that I see the men or the people themselves, just that, as I say, I see something else, like wax or whatever. And yet, what do I see from the window beyond hats and cloaks that might cover artificial machines whose motions might be determined by springs? Okay? Wow, not even zombies, robots. He's imagining quite presciently in a way. But he's imagining that, look, for all I know, when I see those things moving along the street outside in hats and coats and carrying umbrellas or whatever it is, those things might be just machines of some kind, at the very least philosophical zombies, although the idea wasn't around at his time. We just don't have any reason from looking at those entities from the outside to think that they have minds at all. Okay, so you'll have seen in the study guide for this week that you can have, as John Stuart Mill here had, a kind of an argument from analogy. This screen is getting tired from the end of term. It keeps wilting. It doesn't want to stand up and do its job. So here's the argument from analogy in a traditional version. When I burn my hand, okay, maybe there's an example, I experience pain, I cry out, I wince, etc. When other people burn their hands, they also engage in the same kinds of behaviors. They cry out and wince and so on. And from that, you can infer that they are also experiencing pain. I experience pain when I burn my hand, and then I cry out and wince. So you just infer that because other people exhibit the same behavior, they must also be in the same experiential state when they have those sorts of input, like burning their hand. Okay, so an argument from analogy, I mean, it seems on the face of it plausible, probably what we all think in some sense, and how we would justify, if we were forced to, in a philosophy class, justify why we attribute minds to other people. So here's Mill just giving his version of the argument that I've got underneath there. Okay, well, what about this analogy? Is it any good? Well, one thing you might say is that it seems like it's an inductive inference from a sample size of 1, okay? You've got your own experience, and then you inductively make an inference from that to some sort of generalization. But it's not clear that that kind of generalization is warranted. I mean, in most cases where somebody makes a generalization from a sample of 1, we would say, well, that's not really very good evidence. A statistician will tell us that you don't have, it's not statistically significant. You can't get statistical significance just from a single occurrence like that, under most circumstances and for most purposes. So one thing here you might think is, well, you don't know that, how do you know that you're not some kind of atypical or unusual member of your species? Maybe you're the member of your species that has these experiential states, and no other member of your species does. In which case, you're just atypical, and you would not be justified in inductively inferring from your own situation to what's going on for other people. And of course, there are lots of places where we see this. Here's John Stuart Mill, of course. He never said anything like this, but I'm just putting other words in his mouth here, which would also amount to a kind of an argument from analogy by making an inductive inference from 1. You might say, well, this swan I see here is white, so all swans must be white. I said, well, we might need a little bit more evidence than that. Okay, well, he says, I've seen a lot of swans. I've really been going around examining swans all over the place. They were all white, and so I'm going to infer now inductively that all swans are white. But, of course, this is always, any inductive inference is going to be probabilistic, and it may be that when he encounters a black swan, he's going to realize his mistake and figure out that, well, I guess I should have just kept on observing swans, or at least acknowledged the uncertainty in my result, that it was only a probabilistic claim. So there are ways in which we can have bad arguments from analogy like this and inductive inferences that turn out to be disconfirmed, at least. And so you might worry that something similar might happen in the case of the analogy that Mill has in mind for arguing that other people have minds. So here's a better kind of analogy. Let's say a strange new aquatic mammal is discovered. You look at a bunch of them, just like looking at a bunch of swans, and you see that they have similar outward characteristics. They behave in similar sorts of ways. And then one of them dies, this poor guy Max here. We called him Max. And he had normal behavior. He was a typical example of these creatures in terms of outward appearance, but also in terms of behavior. And you dissect Max, and you find, oh, he's got 2 lungs. And then you can see that, well, having that kind of lung capacity and having 2 lungs, that's perfectly suited, in fact, to those behavioral patterns. That would be sufficient given other facts we know in general about the amount of oxygen that this creature will need, and so on. Okay, so you find that out. And from that, you might infer that other creatures of this sort also have lungs, have 2 lungs, let's say. Now this seems like it's a better induction, but why? Well, there are a couple of things going on. First of all, there's a reliability condition. So the type of resemblance that you're focusing on here seems like it's going to be a reliable sign that other members of the same species are going to have the same property that you've found in this one example, namely having the 2 lungs, because the property is linked to the observed resemblance, to the outward behavior. So it can explain that behavior, or it's consistent with it at least. And then there are explanatory considerations that I just mentioned in the very last sentence I said there, that saying that all these creatures have lungs, that's going to better explain the observed similarities, the relevant ones, than anything else. So it's going to be a better explanation than alternative explanations for the outward behavior. Okay, so in that case, it seems like we might be justified in inferring that very probably these creatures have 2 lungs, just on the basis of this one that we found. Because we focused on the relevant similarities and then made an inference to the best explanation from the property that we found in the one example. So here, in fact, a single relevant analogy in a single instance will trump irrelevant similarities even in large samples. So there's a sense in which if you're focusing on the right thing and on the way that it might work as an explanation for certain things like behavior, even one instance is going to be more important and more useful than a whole pile of samples where the similarity is not relevant. And so by contrast, even large samples can be misleading if they're not representative. Okay, so that seems like it might be better. And so you might try to have a revised argument from analogy, slightly different from the one that Mill gave, or perhaps just a more charitable interpretation of what Mill was saying. So here what you'd say is, well, I'm going to identify a relevant similarity in input-output relations. Why? Because any 2 things are similar in a multitude of different ways, but not all similarities are going to be relevant. So identify some relevant similarity in input-output relations. And then infer a similarity in the target property. So here it's going to be mental states, for example, pain. And then take various explanatory considerations into account and say that the target property best explains the observed similarity in input-output relations. So the input-output relations, of course, are just the kinds of things that normally cause pain. The output is going to be observed behavior of wincing, crying out, etc. You're inferring this target property, a mental state, phenomenal state of pain, and you're going to say that that target property, the mental experience of pain, is going to best explain the similarity in the input-output relations, leaving aside things like mad pain that we talked about before. Okay, so on that basis, you might think that when you see other people behaving in the same sort of way, given the same sorts of inputs, then you might have this sort of argument to infer that they also have mental states like you have when you give those outputs in those kinds of input situations. Now, just very briefly, what we'll do today is, in kind of going through all of these things, we'll just state very quickly a problem maybe with that suggestion. Here, one problem you might think is the problem of mental causation. Remember, the problem of mental causation is whether our behaviors are, properly speaking, caused by our mental states, or instead just by physical states of ours, where those physical states are not identical to mental states. Basically, the suggestion is that mental states are epiphenomenal. Remember when we read Nagel, epiphenomenalism says that maybe there's some kind of covariance between mental states, like beliefs and desires, and physical states and what they seem to cause. But it seems like you can have just a sufficient explanation of the physical behavior in terms of the physical causes, and the appeal to mental states as causes of the physical behavior seems to be something just otiose and over and above the physical causal explanation. And so in that case then, mental states, remember the analogy I gave, are just like puffs of smoke coming out of a train as it goes along. They're not really causing anything. Maybe they've caused the relations between each other. Nagel allows for that possibility, but they don't cause physical things. So that's at least a possibility, you might think, and in that case then the argument from analogy might not be any good. Okay, another similar move you might make is to say that, well, in attributing mental states to other people, beliefs and desires and so on, what you're doing is something similar to the standard way that you will infer the existence of theoretical entities like electrons. So I mentioned before that electrons are too small to actually see, strictly speaking, because they're smaller than the wavelength of light. But we infer their existence and we conduct experiments to see whether they're positing those things' existence, whether they seem to have any causal influence in the world. And we establish that they do, and so our positing of those theoretical entities is warranted then. So no observation here is needed, and similarly you might think, well, no observation is needed of others' mental states at least, and you can just posit mental states for other people as a theoretical entity that works for you in explaining and predicting people's behavior in folk psychology in a way that, say, electrons work in physics. So that's a similar kind of move. Again, one quick worry we might have here when we looked at the Churchland's view of eliminative materialism, which said that ultimately we'll have neuroscience worked out to such a degree that we won't really talk in folk psychological terms anymore at all. Again, where folk psychological terms are just terms like belief and desire and so on. We won't appeal to those kinds of things as psychological entities in our folk psychological theory of trying to explain other people's behavior once we have neuroscience worked out. So folk psychology isn't really a theory at all. So in that case then, positing these folk psychological entities, beliefs and desires, mental states, would end up not being warranted. So if eliminative materialism is true, then this kind of inductive inference won't be warranted. Okay, you might think that there's a conceptual link between stimulus and behavior. So you don't need to make any inference to intermediate knowledge or anything intermediate like a mental state here at all. So basically, what you're doing here, and we've looked at this view, if you'll recall, you suggest that these inner processes or putative inner processes stand in need of outward explanation. So a state or process like pain or being in pain stands in need of outward criteria. What are they? Well, they're the behaviors that people exhibit when they are in pain, supposedly in pain, in the input conditions that cause those behaviors. And so you kind of criteria fix the meaning of pain just in terms of the criteria that are outwardly observable, like behavior in certain input conditions. And you think, well, maybe that's all we need to do then. And so basically, you're making a move like the behaviorists made in fixing the criteria from the outside like this. It's also similar to functionalism, and then you posit the existence of this thing that can engage in causal relations with other mental states on the basis of the inputs and certain outputs, etc. But as logical behaviorism showed us, maybe we don't actually need to, maybe the outward criteria are all we'll need, and we don't have to make the functionalist move to positing these things as mediators. So it seems like this strong conceptual link might not be there at all, and in fact we can just get away with the criteria fixing criteria, just the outward behavior and the inputs. In which case then we'd be dispensing with the inner state, strictly speaking, altogether. So this comes up in the study guide, and we're just going to mention it briefly, but it goes back to Wittgenstein here and his claim that, well, look, mental state terms, the terms that we use in our language for talking about mental states, they're public because they're linguistic, and we can we share those terms, and we can talk about them and so on. But they don't, strictly speaking, refer to private mental states at all. But we can use public criteria, like the input-output relations, observed behavior in the presence of certain conditions, like red-hot frying pans, and the output is screaming in pain, or at least screaming. So we can just use public criteria like that to determine the meaning of the mental state terms. So that was the behaviorist's move, of course, the logical behaviorist. And we saw the worries with that, whether we can actually translate these mental state terms entirely into descriptions of input-output relations, including behavioral dispositions. But Wittgenstein has a famous example here, which is supposed to illustrate what he's getting at least. So he says, suppose everyone has a box. You've all got a box. Everyone has a box, and it's got something in it. We call it a beetle. But you can't look into anyone else's box. Nobody can look into anybody else's box. It's forbidden. And everyone says that they know what a beetle is because they can look into their own box and they see what's in that box, which that's the thing they call, with the term, the public linguistic expression, beetle. So here he thinks it would be possible for everyone to have something entirely different in their box. And so the thing in the box for him, in his terms, has no place in the language game, in public discourse using language at all. So we have this expression, beetle, but we'll just have to get away with using it and not have a place in our language game for the thing that it's supposed to be referring to, because we've got no way of knowing whether if what everybody else has in their box is what we have in their box. And you can see, of course, the metaphor here is supposed to be, we've got an expression like belief, and we've all got maybe something in our box, our head, that we call belief. Well, this is a belief, but we can't look into each other's heads in the same way here we can't look into each other's beetle boxes. And so the suggestion here is we should just do away with the thing that we say it is we're referring to, and just get away with using the term, the language, the linguistic term, and define it then just in terms of the input-output relations. So that was the behaviorist move, and Wittgenstein was a behaviorist of a sort. But of course, the worry again here is that we're actually leaving out what we wanted to explain, which was the subjectivity of conscious experience, let's say. At least one of the things we wanted to explain. Okay, so yeah, you can make that move, but then you're sort of you're not explaining the thing that you started out to explain, which seems like it might be a problem. okay, what other strategies might you have for trying to establish whether other people have minds, mental states? You might reject the asymmetry altogether. This supposed asymmetry between the way that you know your own mind and the way that you know other people's supposed minds. So you might think that self-knowledge really might not be that different from our knowledge of other minds. So people talk about introspection and looking in on your own mental states. But maybe there isn't that much difference. So Ryle, of course, another behaviorist, says the following. In some sense, he thinks we eavesdrop on our own voiced utterances. I mean, it's a description of what people's experience is like, and some people might beg to differ. But in any case, there might be some truth in this, that we sort of eavesdrop on our own voiced utterances and our own silent monologues. They kind of seem to go on, and we listen in on them in more or less the same way that we listen in on other people's conversations. And so we overhear ourselves mentally speaking to ourselves in more or less the same way, or in some analogous way at least, to the way in which we hear others. So you might think, on those grounds, maybe we can get an argument up and running that on the basis of the asymmetry being deflated a little bit, that in fact we're just as warranted in attributing mental states to others as we are in thinking that we have them ourselves. And this is similar, of course, to what we looked at last week, Dennett's view in the intentional systems theory. Remember, he says that all there is to being a believer, a true believer, by which he just means actually having a belief. So all there is to having a belief is being a system whose behavior is reliably predictable via the intentional stance. Remember, for Dennett, the criterion of whether something actually has a belief is just whether it's predictably useful for you to take the intentional stance, namely attributing beliefs and desires to explain the behavior of that thing, to take the intentional stance towards that thing. And that's all there is. So all there is to really and truly believing that P is being an intentional system for which P occurs as the best, most predictive interpretation. Okay, so clearly if that's all there is, in fact, to being or having a belief, for some entity to have a belief, then it seems like, well, we're totally warranted in taking the intentional stance towards each other. And so if that is literally all there is to having a belief, then we get to establish that other people have beliefs fairly directly and immediately. But of course, there are the worries that we looked at briefly at the end last week about whether the intentional systems theory really does give us an account of what it is, all there is to having a belief. You might look at some kinds of evidence that suggests that we can somehow hook ourselves up to somebody else's brain and have a transfer of information that way. I mean, there's some evidence of this kind of thing going on. But the question is whether it is really, as the title of this article, for example, suggests, direct access to another person's mind. And it seems like it's not. It's still an indirect connection. So maybe some informational state that they're in then causes you to be in at least a similar informational state. But it's not clear that we've really got access to their minds in that way. I mean, for all we know, still, they could just be some kind of bizarre device that when we try to hook up to it to find out what state it's in, it just gives us some information and tries to make us believe that it is in some mental state, when in fact it's not. Yeah.
The problem there is like it's still coming from your point of view. It's not like so you'd never be able to know if that was if you were connected. It's only from your point of view.
Yes. Okay. Good. So if you still have the asymmetry thing in mind, and you think, well, look, you know, it's kind of like the reverse strategy to the intentional stance, where you just attribute beliefs if it's useful for you predictively to take the intentional stance towards other people, which it is, of course. So you're rejecting the asymmetry in some way of how you establish whether you're in a mental state, how you establish somebody else in a mental state. But you might think, well, look, I'm going to accept the asymmetry, or at least as a first step, at least grant part of it, that the way I have access to my own mind is through introspection. But now I'm going to reject the asymmetry by going the other direction and say I'm going to try and get the same access as I have to my own mind to other people's minds. Okay? And then the problem that you just mentioned comes in, that we're still not getting it directly in the way that we apparently do to our own minds introspectively. We're not getting the information directly in that way. It's still from your own point of view and not from this other person's point of view. Okay, so there are various suggestions about how you might try to solve the problem of other minds. If any of them seem appealing to you, you can think about them further, and there's lots of reading you can do, which you'll be able to find in that Stanford Encyclopedia article that I mentioned. But for the moment, let's move on to the other kinds of minds problems. So